We begin tonight in Havana. It was the ultimate encounter between capitalism and communism, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. 13 days in October 1962, when three world leaders, controlling armies with enough ammunition to ignite an apocalypse, engaged in a supreme test of wills and decided the fate of nations. It's a lesson in leadership and of trying to find a path to peace in the midst of provocation, intense pressure, and growing panic. Michael Voss recounts a legendary conflict that's been called the most dangerous moment in history.
Fidel Castro came to power in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. He quickly became a formidable force on the world stage. The United States was determined to prevent communism taking a foothold in the Americas. In 1961, President Kennedy tried to orchestrate regime change by backing an ill-fated invasion called the Bay of Pigs. It was to push Fidel Castro firmly into Moscow's arms. President Khrushchev, who was experiencing his own tensions with the US over communism, was angry that the US had placed nuclear missiles in Europe and particularly Turkey on Russia's doorstep. He saw Cuba as a way of getting even. It was a gamble that, once discovered, almost led to World War III.
Yo creo que la crisis fue un momento de mucho peligro para toda la humanidad. Habían pasado 17 años del fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. A pesar de que habían ocurrido otros acontecimientos mundiales en ese periodo, del 45 al 62, no fueron tan peligrosos como este. Aquí no se estaba dirimiendo el conflicto con armas convencionales, sino se dirimía el conflicto con armas nucleares.
Tomás Díaz is a Cuban historian who spent years researching the crisis and has written 6 books on the subject. He offered to show me what's left of the missile sites captured by the Americans on film. The closest missile site lies about 100 kilometers west of Havana at the end of what are today dirt farm tracks. So the missiles came down here. The first indication that we were close came from this isolated farm, where a curved concrete beam was being used to fence in a chicken hut. From there, we had to continue on foot. Are we there?
This is the missile silo.
It's a missile silo.
Yes. Este era un grupo de un regimiento coheteril R-12. Aquí el personal del regimiento era alrededor de 3.000 personas. En este grupo había 6 misiles R-12 y se había construido 4 posiciones de lanzamiento.
Did the idea come from Moscow, or was it Fidel Castro who asked for nuclear missiles to be placed on the island?
Esto fue una idea de Khrushchev. Cuando se le propuso a la dirección cubana, a Fidel Castro, la instalación de estos misiles, primero él dijo, el primero preguntó, que para la defensa de Cuba no hacían falta estos medios, sino que con un tratado entre Cuba y la Unión Soviética, en que un ataque a Cuba significaría un ataque a la Unión Soviética, ya bastaba. Pero los soviéticos insistieron y hasta que plantearon esto.
They didn't have to take the step of actually putting nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Tom Putnam is director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, which has recently released thousands of declassified documents relating to the period.
So that's the gamble that Khrushchev took. He thought he could put the missiles in there. He thought he could do it without the United States finding out. And then he thought once they did find out that JFK would do nothing about it.
But Kennedy did find out.
The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets.
The first missiles the United States discovered, they had the ability to reach Washington and New York from Cuba. Then there were slightly longer range missiles that could have reached the whole territory of the United States. There were 24 of them.
Michael Dobbs is one of the leading American experts on the crisis and author of 1 Minute to Midnight.
Well, the United States had nuclear superiority at the time, but the question was, even if a single Soviet missile had succeeded in getting through and landed on an American city, Kennedy asked this question, how many Americans would have been killed? And the answer was about 500,000.
The missiles were discovered, and what followed was one of the most highly charged foreign policy debates in the hemisphere's history. President Kennedy spent almost a week in lockdown with his crisis team deciding the course of his action. It was on October 22nd that he informed the world of the prospect of nuclear confrontation.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The United States answer to Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress.
President Kennedy had been under intense pressure from the military and others to go for direct armed intervention. Instead, he chose a naval blockade in the hope that diplomacy could be made to work. But it was a close-run call. A new exhibition at the National Archives in Washington, displaying images and documentation and newly released audio recordings from the crisis, shows just how close it was. President Kennedy had even prepared an alternative television address announcing an invasion of Cuba. There was another deadly secret, though, which remained hidden from the spy planes. As well as warheads for ballistic missiles, the Soviets had also shipped small, tactical, battlefield nuclear weapons.
We only found out about these tactical nuclear weapons about 30, 40 years later. Kennedy didn't understand that at the time. Tactical nuclear warheads that could have been used to wipe out an American invading force.
It has since emerged that Fidel Castro had written to Khrushchev urging that in the case of an attack on Cuba, then they should use these tactical nuclear weapons.
Estuvimos muy cerca de una guerra nuclear.
In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders as they had been during past invasion scares. The waterfront in Havana and along other parts of the coast bristled with gun emplacements. Castro has put every able-bodied man through military training. He has even armed some as young as 12 years of age.
Tomas Diaz was 16 back then and already part of a militia. Were people here afraid at the time?
No, realmente no teníamos miedo. Ya nos habían acostumbrado a la agresión. Estábamos acostumbrados desde el año 59, el año 60. El fin de año de 1960, 1961, estábamos movilizados. Nos movilizamos cuando Playa Girón. Estábamos enfrentando la lucha contra bandidos, es decir, de las bandas armadas contrarrevolucionarias. Es decir, había un espíritu combativo del pueblo en defensa de la revolución.
Elsewhere, many feared that the world was about to end.
In general, the higher you were up in the administration, the more worried you were. Kennedy himself estimated the chance of nuclear war somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 2. By Black Saturday, October the 27th, arrangements were being made to evacuate the White House, to fly the president to the underground, secure locations in the hills of West Virginia. People were telling their families to get out of town, to load up this family station wagon and drive it as far away from Washington as possible.
In the end, nuclear war was averted. Presidents Kennedy and Khrushchev had been engaged in secret back-channel diplomacy. The Soviets agreed to take all their missiles out of Cuba in return for a promise not to invade, plus a private commitment to remove US missiles from Turkey. Fidel Castro felt betrayed.
Well, the paradox is that Castro and his brother Raúl are still in power 50 years later. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Khrushchev was deposed in 1964. So if you want to think about winners from the Cuban Missile Crisis purely in terms of who survived the longest, it is Fidel Castro.
Today, the missile silos are overrun with vegetation and surrounded by fields of sugarcane. There is one ballistic missile left in Cuba, a museum piece acquired from the Russians after it was decommissioned as part of a later arms limitation treaty. It remains a grim reminder of just how close the world came to all-out nuclear war.
Michael Voss joins us now from Havana to give us some additional insight on this historic look back. Michael, thank you for your report and welcome. Can you describe the mood in Havana during the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis? How is the event being remembered?
I think the mood here is one of defiance, Elaine. There's going to be a commemorative event held on Monday in the park where the remaining ballistic missile still stands. Officially, there are no regrets at having allowed the Soviets to place missiles on the island or having brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. They still feel they were betrayed by the Russians, but otherwise the mood here is of pride, having stood up to the world, got the United States to agree not to invade the island, and that 50 years on, the Castros are still in power and the revolution is intact.
Well, can you talk about the weapons initially left behind by the Russians?
Well, these tactical nuclear warheads, these small nuclear weapons, at one point it appeared that the Russians would leave them with the Cubans. In November of that year, a senior Soviet envoy, Mikoyan, came to Cuba. We now know from documents released in Moscow that Fidel Castro vented his anger at Mikoyan at having been kept in the dark about the secret negotiations between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And afterwards, Mikoyan felt that with Castro in such a volatile mood, it wouldn't be wise to leave these tactical nuclear weapons behind, and they were eventually withdrawn.
Well, bring us up to date on the U.S. embargo against Cuba. How bad was it back then compared to how it is now?
Well, it was put in place before the missile crisis, and it's 50 years later, it's still in place. It's been eased a little. You can now sell U.S. food, for example, to Cuba, but there are, if anything, even stricter financial sanctions against Cuba. Now, having agreed publicly back in 1962 not to invade the island, the U.S. administration did continue to look for ways at regime change by other means. For example, the hundreds of CIA-sponsored assassination attempts against Fidel Castro.
Well, what is the legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Is there a lasting lesson here?
Elaine, I think the legacy of the crisis is that it has helped shape the debate over how to handle similar confrontations. Remember, it's now Iran who's in the news over their nuclear ambitions.
Michael Voss in Havana, Cuba, thank you so much for your report.